CDC, we're going to come to you at 4:30, 4:15. Okay? 20, which is...
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the press briefing by the Honorable Santia Bradshaw, Minister of Education in the Ministry of Education, Technological and Vocational Training. We are here to share with the general public, parents, guardians, teachers, the proposal for Term 2 for the academic year 2020 to 2021. So I want to invite to the lectern the Honorable Santia Bradshaw. Minister.
Pleasant good evening to everyone. First of all, let me wish you all season's greetings. I hope everyone has enjoyed the holiday season, and we're all looking forward certainly to 2021. Today's press briefing, as Ms. Adamson, the Chief Education Officer acting, has indicated, is intended to provide some background in relation to where we are at the level of our educational institutions and our preparedness for the schools for the start of the term on the 5th of January. As you know, our teachers will be going back into school on the 4th to prepare through their management meetings, and also the students will be returning on the 5th of January. Over the past few months, government has sought to safeguard the health and the well-being of every local and visitor to this island. And of paramount importance to us has been securing and maintaining the safety of our students, teachers, and ancillary staff throughout the education system. We've also sought to protect the importance of learning, recognizing the benefit that lies in teaching, especially face-to-face instruction, and the harm that can come to our students from its withdrawal. Almost all of the studies that have been conducted to date, whether here or outside of Barbados, reaffirm that COVID-19 could erase important gains that we've made in education. And our collective mission must certainly be to ensure that we preserve what we have while at the same time preparing for what lies ahead after the COVID-19 pandemic is over. Our response in the Ministry of Education to this pandemic has and continues to be led by the science and the advice of the public health officials in the Ministry of Health and Wellness, the COVID-19 Monitoring Unit, as well as our international partners, the Pan American Health Organization, the World Health Organization, and of course, UNICEF. Based on the clarity and the strength of the advice at times, we've had inevitably to make some judgments on the best way forward for Barbados' education system, balancing all the relevant factors, whether it's the number of cases, the risk of community transmission, access to devices, Wi-Fi and connectivity. And our overall mission has always been and will continue to be to ensure that no child is left behind in our educational system, pandemic or no pandemic. Sometimes it's easy to lose sight of how far we have come when we allow our fears to get the better of us. And I know that as many of you would have woken up to news over the course of the last few days of, in many of our source markets, hearing stories about new strains of this particular virus, I know that there's a lot of anxiety as it relates to how do we proceed as a country. I want to say at the outset that obviously, I sit on the cabinet subcommittee. I know that the persons within the Ministry of Health and Wellness have been working tirelessly to be able to contain the virus here in Barbados. Even when we have had within education our own challenges at one of our secondary schools, the response that was provided by the Ministry of Health and Wellness was certainly, exemplary in terms of being able to offer the necessary support and guidance when we suspected cases of the COVID-19 amongst our school children. And so it gives me a certain level of confidence that where we are today, we could not be there if we did not have the relevant health personnel to be able to provide the necessary support and guidance to us and to be able to ensure that we are all safe. When we reflect on where we have come from, immediately, as we make certain judgments, we had to make a determination early on whether we continued school in the early period of the March time frame when we had the first cases of COVID. And we were placed in a situation where we had to make some decisions as it related to whether we would shut down the schools. And we didn't hesitate. We did so because we knew at that time that we didn't have sufficient information on which to do anything different. Fortunately, after that, we moved to emergency response teaching. We were well aware that it was not the typical online environment that we hear so much about, but we recognized that we had to do something to respond to ensure that children were still able to have some level of communication with their teachers. And so we introduced the emergency response teaching. We reached out to the private sector to be able to provide a number of devices. Even though we have devices in the system, as you could appreciate, it was not enough to be able to cater to all of the students. And so we would have moved towards appealing to the private sector entities and individuals who graciously came forward and who continue to provide the support to the ministry to be able to allow children who would not normally be able to have access to these devices to be provided with them. We did training of our teachers because what is now described as a blended approach is something that perhaps while most people know how to use the computer, we had not necessarily been preparing our teachers to make the transition to a blended approach of having some face-to-face and online teaching at the same time. And thanks to the IDB, we will certainly be continuing to train our teachers in the future. One of the things that we have benefited from over the last couple of months, and I've just come out of a meeting with the Cabinet Subcommittee and also the stakeholders in education or various union leaders and Ministry of Health officials. And one of the things that has been consistent throughout this period is that we have benefited as a country because we have had the cooperation from the unions, and we've certainly had cooperation from all of our stakeholders. We've had extensive consultations with the principals. As you know, at the end of last term, I met with the teachers as well, and I even had the opportunity to engage with students to be able to get a sense from them as to how COVID-19 was impacting them, and really what would they like to see us do differently if we had the opportunity to do so. We have been really fortunate as a country to have the level of interaction and engagement with our various stakeholders who have helped to influence not only our return to school when we had the students going back for the 11 plus, but certainly at the beginning of term 1, where because of the interventions made by the various representatives of the various stakeholder bodies, we were able to put on the table some proposals to ensure that both teachers, students, and certainly administrators across the schools felt comfortable coming back into the school environment. And today I can say that having come out of the meeting with the respective entities over the course of the past few days and certainly weeks, I remain very humbled by the fact that when our back is against the wall as a country, many of our stakeholders rise to the occasion to put aside differences and to be able to do what is in the best interest of the country. I say that because while the ministry may have a vision for how we would like to see school unfolding, it is important that, whether it's the criticisms or, the concerns are expressed so that we can better shape the way forward to be able to return children into the school environment. So last term, we found ourselves in a situation where we gave the opportunity to a number of our principals to be able to look at various options as to how to return students to the school environment. And we did so because we recognize that obviously no school is the same. No school plant is the same size. We have different students performing at different levels. And it was important for the first time, I think in the history of this ministry certainly, that we engage with our principals and management of various institutions along with our education officers, and we shared with them the different models that were being proposed by the international organizations. And many of them determined for themselves, after consultation with their staff, how best school could return to normalcy for term 1. As a consequence, we had a number of students who were able to return face-to-face. We also had some variances at some other institutions where some students were able to return to school 3 days a week, 2 days online. There were some where there was 1 week on, 1 week off. We also had one instance where we had one school at the secondary level which was able to put in place the shift system as well. So depending on which institution it was, we were able to kind of test exactly what model would actually work for our particular institutions. And let me just say that I know that there have been some concerns by parents as it relates to the amount of time that students might have been home, or in some cases the distractions that would have presented themselves for students who ordinarily would not be able to focus on their studies without being in the classroom environment. And we've taken all of that into account. Particularly because many students would have said to us that they really wanted to get back into a face-to-face and as normal as an environment as they could possibly get. When I use the word normal, I want to just reiterate that we're not talking of the old norm, but we're talking about a new normal in our society where we obviously have to be wearing masks, we have to be physical distancing, and certainly we have to be sanitizing as well. And so the new norm for students was one where even if they had to adhere to these protocols, many of them wanted to at least be given the opportunity with all of the safety protocols in place to be able to return to the school environment. When we discussed with the teachers, it was the same thing. There was a call for making sure that things were safe in the school environment, but equally making sure as well that students, particularly who were exhibiting a lot of social and emotional behaviors and finding difficulty trying to adjust to this new norm, that they were given the opportunity to be able to come back to school. So after all of our extensive discussions, we would have met with the Ministry of Health and Wellness and officials from the COVID monitoring unit. And I'm pleased to say that there is overall consensus amongst the stakeholders that we have to move in the direction of being able to allow our students to return to the classroom environment fully. Of course, on the 5th of January, it will not mean that every single student will return to the classroom, one time. But what it does mean is that we will be working over the course of the next few weeks with the COVID monitoring unit to be able to gradually return students to the classroom. We have prioritized a number of students, primarily the special needs students, who I think many of you are well aware, more than any of the other students, have particular challenges not having the same routine that they're accustomed to. And so we are working with the various special needs institutions and the special units to ensure that those students can return to normalcy in the school environment over the course of the next couple of weeks. We're also prioritizing our 11+ students, all the students who are sitting the common entrance examination, because we recognize that in normal times, students are very anxious about the examination. I think parents are anxious, teachers are anxious, the general public becomes very anxious about this examination. And in a pandemic, one of the things that was very clear from a number of the students who spoke to us was that they too are feeling additional anxiety as a result of the uncertainties of when the exam is going to take place and whether or not they're going to be able to complete the syllabus in time. We did a poll of a number of our Class 4 teachers because at the primary level, because we recognized that to move forward, we needed to be fully apprised of where they were in the syllabus, fully apprised of how they felt about the fact that perhaps about 80% of the students were being able to do face-to-face in term 1. But also that we wanted to make sure that there was no child that felt, or parent that felt, that the students would be at a particular disadvantage as a result of not being able to have full face-to-face. So we have prioritized 11+ students, and they will make a gradual return to school over the course of the next couple of weeks. For those that have not been in school fully for 5 days, all principals have been made aware that they will now be making the necessary accommodation to allow them to gradually return into the school environment. We have also recognize that the date for the 11 plus exam, which was traditionally scheduled in May, is perhaps not going to be practical for persons to be able to sit that exam on that date, given the amount of time that has been lost. And so a decision has been taken by the ministry to allow the moving of the date until the 22nd of June of 2021. It has arisen out of several representations by teachers indicating a better level of comfort if they had the additional time to complete the syllabus, and also a preference that we didn't move it until July, which is obviously in the high peak of their vacation, as would have happened last year. So at this point, the common entrance examination is now going to be scheduled for the 22nd of June, and I hope that parents, teachers, and certainly our students will breathe a sigh of relief over the course of the next few days and certainly the coming weeks and months as it relates to their preparation for that particular examination. As it relates to the secondary school students, we recognize that what would happen is that students who are preparing for CXC have had a relatively rough year, particularly for 2020. And many of the students who are now preparing for 2021, we wanted to ensure that they were able also to be not particularly disadvantaged by being out of school. So we've also given priority to our secondary school students who are at the 5th form, 6th form level to ensure that they can return to the school environment. And then over the course of the next few weeks, working with the COVID monitoring unit, we will likely see the resumption of other classes being entered into the timetable at our respective secondary schools. We have also given priority to first formers because for the most part, many of our first formers have expressed deep concern that making the transition from primary school to secondary school has resulted in many of them not being able to bond with the other students and to meet new students as they enter the first form environment. But they've also not been able to have that opportunity to really even bond with their teachers as well. And we believe that this is particularly important as the young people are transitioning from adolescence into teenage years in particular. And we want to make sure that we give them the best opportunity to at least have some degree of normalcy returning to what all of us, I believe, have become accustomed to over the years when we go into a new environment in any type of institution. So we've given priority to that class of students as well. So coming on the 5th of January, the intention is that the status quo remains the same. Essentially, if you have been attending school on Tuesdays at the end of last term, you will continue to attend on Tuesday. But you will also be notified if there are any changes by the respective schools over the course of the coming weeks. But I think people will feel more relieved to know where the priorities are for the schools. And as we are able to work with the COVID monitoring unit to be able to look at spacing and to look at whether we need additional off-site locations, the intention is that we can certainly increase the presence of more students on the school plan. Now that brings me to the issue of transportation, because this issue has been certainly raised at many of our meetings. Obviously, increased number of students over the course of the next couple of weeks and months will also mean that there will be more children on the roads and therefore more children using public transportation. So we have started our discussions with the Transport Board looking at how we can either stagger the times of the school day. We have also discussed aftercare and before care programs at our schools, which will now be specifically structured from within the Ministry of Education. As you know, many schools at the level of the PTAs often organize the structure for the before and after care programs. But we recognize that, education, the Ministry of Education has a role to play in this, and I think we want to be in a position now to provide the framework for PTAs and any other interested persons to be able to offer their services to the schools. Obviously, in many cases, it's at a nominal fee, but what we see this being able to do as we seek to extend the school day is simply to be able to allow for a decrease in the congestion on our roads, because it means that if children are able to be at school either earlier or they're able to stay there later, it is unlikely that we will have the level of congestion that you have often seen in the past. And so we're working with each of the institutions across the system to be able to look at what programs we can put in place, how we bring a level of structure to it, because there are lots of our give back students, for instance, who are no doubt interested in giving back some time on afternoons. And in talking to our staff, we recognize that this is a perfect opportunity to be able to allow not just give back students, but certainly retired teachers and persons who want to provide that educational support to students either before or after school, to have the opportunity to do so in a very structured way. So we are utilizing certainly the model from the Give Back program to be able to add value to extending the school day and providing the necessary support for our students in the school environment. It also means that extracurricular activities, they won't resume on the 5th of January. But the intention, obviously, is that over a period of time, those activities will gradually be brought back into play. I think I should say here that physical activity in all of the literature during this COVID pandemic is pointing to the fact that we need to ensure that children still engage in physical activity. But that has to be coupled with, obviously, particular guidelines and protocols to be safe and to ensure that we have the physical distancing and, where possible, to wear masks. In turn, that also means that I know an announcement will come shortly in relation to our support for NAPSAC and BSAC, which the COVID monitoring unit has basically given the all clear to, in order to allow students to again participate in limited levels of physical activity in a competitive nature. And again, it is a recognition that we cannot completely restrict all activity, because we will end up with students who simply just sit in front of the computer all day. And that brings with it a whole bunch of other complications as well. So we're sensitive to this. I think the unit is sensitive to this as well. And we would have had last year a number of our physical education teachers weighing in on protocols that were approved by the COVID monitoring unit, for which we now want to ensure that over the course of the next few weeks and months that we can certainly see more of that happening within our school plans. I want to take this opportunity to also point to the fact that there's a program that we are instituting shortly, which is the digital literacy program, simply because we recognize that many of our students are very equipped to deal with smart devices, but in many cases, using them for the purpose of education is often challenging. And we've gotten a lot of feedback that, many kids don't understand how to attach a document after preparing it for homework and being able to send it back to the teacher. So we want to take the opportunity, certainly in the first couple of weeks of the term, to be able to work with our ITCs in the schools, the information technology coordinators, to be able to improve their skill set in teaching students to be able to get online, know what is the correct etiquette that is required from them, to be able to communicate with their teachers in the event that they have to do any online classes in the future, but certainly to be able to prepare them to utilize the technology as much as possible. The school monitors that would have been introduced into the school, fortunate for us, those have worked exceptionally well. And I can take the opportunity to really say thank you to all of the monitors. There were over 212 individuals deployed across a number of our nursery and primary schools in the last term. Many of them not only provided the support in terms of ensuring that our students were wearing masks, that they were sanitizing, and keeping distance both in and out of the classroom, but many of them did a number of the simple tasks that students required, tying shoelaces, giving a lot of support, and just simply being there to support our teachers across the various institutions. And the feedback has been very positive in relation to the monitors, and we intend to sensitize them again on the 4th of January as well at the Wilde Gymnasium for a session where they will be able to share any of their concerns, but also to continue the training, because just like every other sector of education, it is important that anyone who is interfacing with our children have the opportunity to be able to be trained and to be retrained and to be retooled. So that will also be taking place. The other aspect that we have looked at as well for term 2 is a response to the call for assistance with social and emotional support, not only for students, but also for teachers. The reality is that this is a very difficult period for everyone. And it is no different in education. In fact, many of our teachers are parents. Many of our teachers have the same anxieties, the same fears as all the rest of us in the population. And it is important that as we strengthen our student support services within the Ministry of Education to provide for support for students, that we equally recognize that the students require the support of their teachers in the classroom. And their mental health is really something that is of paramount importance to us. And therefore, we will continue our support hotline for student support services in the Ministry of Education. We have also added additional safety officers into 6 of our secondary schools. I understand that just today, the social worker interviews are being conducted for the primary schools, and we should have a complement of about 7 school counselors being deployed in early January as well. So while we are in the midst of a pandemic, we recognize that we cannot not do the things that we would have intended to do if everything was back to normal. And one of the things that I think many of you are well aware that concerns all of us is the level of violence that we've seen taking place amongst our students, whether in the classroom, on the school plant, or on the road. And therefore, it is important that while we return to a level of face-to-face instruction that is a bit heightened than normal, one of the things that we must equally do is to provide the support in the classroom and on the school premises, which I believe is sadly lacking over the course of the last couple of years for many of our students. And that support will extend to our teaching profession as well. So I'm hopeful that as we have sought the input of all of the various stakeholders in our discussions and our deliberations, that while we cannot address every single issue that can possibly arise because there's no precedent for COVID-19 that any of us can follow, I'm hopeful that given that we have spoken extensively to all of the stakeholders, we've taken into account all of the concerns as best as we could, and in setting up our committees, we have looked to include all of the various stakeholders to be able to continue to help us in the Ministry of Education to monitor what is happening in the classroom environment. So Mr. Glenn Price, who is the Deputy Chief Education Officer, he is going to head a team comprising of the various stakeholders, which is going to be reviewing and monitoring each of the schools across the island to ensure that they are compliant with the COVID monitoring protocols, but also to ensure that the priorities are given to the students that I've outlined earlier, but also to ensure that we have the gradual reintroduction of students into the classroom environment. That, I believe, is a synopsis of where we are and the state of play in relation to the return to school for students at the start of the Hillary term. And we are looking forward to welcoming our students back into the environment in as safe a way as possible. We've increased the janitorial staff because we recognize you have to ensure that you have the sanitizing done of these schools. We've also added some additional teachers as well, because that was a common concern from the teaching profession last year, as many teachers worked beyond the call of duty to be able to address the needs of students. And so we have been able to secure the resources to be able to allow for that gradual introduction of additional support into the school system to ensure that teachers are comfortable, and if teachers are comfortable, hopefully our students will also be comfortable. As I close, I want to remind Barbadians, in particular our parents, that the wearing of masks is important to all of us as a people. It cannot be that our students leave home on mornings with masks in their bags, but when they get on the buses, they take them off, or they only put them on when they get to the school gate. and they take them off and they don't want to wear them again. It is important that as parents you remind students of this pandemic and the dangers of this pandemic and impress on them the need to wear their masks. Many of our complaints have come about secondary school students who we believed were going to be more responsible in this pandemic because we did not place monitors in the secondary schools, but we recognize that the problem is not necessarily in the schools itself because they're complying in the schools. But when students leave the school plant and they go on the road, we're recognizing that we're having some challenges with them wearing their masks. And in fairness, I think many of us from time to time do drop our guard. But we have to, in this environment, particularly in an environment where we're seeing so many things happening around us, we have to remind each other and to remind our students not to drop the ball, because we have been safe so far, because we have basically held each other together and reminded each other to be able to sanitize and to keep the physical distance, and certainly to wear the mask. And I would want to certainly encourage all students to be able to comply with the protocols, because what we're doing in relation to term 2, once everything remains as is to ensure that you can return to the school environment in as safe a way as humanly possible. The distancing in the classroom is presently recommended at 3 feet for desks. That will continue to be maintained. In some cases, at I believe the nursery level, we had a situation where some of them had placed the desks 6 feet apart. And I know Ms. Adamson and the team have been working with them to be able to allow more students to be able to come back into the classroom environment, because they've agreed to the 3-foot rule. And therefore, it will mean that a number of our smaller kids will also have the opportunity as well to have that engagement with teachers at the level of the face-to-face instruction. Over the course of the next few weeks as well, we are hopeful that we will have the devices coming into the island. The reality is that, Kenya is not Trinidad, and therefore all of the contractual arrangements are being put in place in order to be able to get the 21,000 devices into the country. We recognize that while we are waiting on devices, Barbados' education cannot be on standstill. And therefore, our intention is to continue to prepare our teachers as best as we can, using all the available resources, both locally through the Urdiston Teachers Training College, but also through our partners in Finland as well, who has an excellent model for education and certainly education reform, to be able to work with our teachers to prepare them for not just an online approach to learning, but certainly to other models of teaching students differently over the course of the next couple of years. So technology is here to stay. I hope that COVID is not here to stay, but certainly we have to prepare for life after COVID-19, and that certainly from the Ministry of Education, that is what we intend to do. So at this point, I will open the floor to questions from the press. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Minister. I have a few questions. I don't know if you want to give you all one time or one at a time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you would have mentioned that you are hoping to have a phased approach to the return of students to the classroom, face-to-face classes. You have a timeline that you're hoping to have this full system integrated when all students would be back on the school plans?
I think it is fair to say that, every day there is a different dynamic that arises as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. If I am honest, I would tell you that at the end of the term, when we completed our consultations and we spoke with the Ministry of Health, we were at a stage where we felt confident that we could move to a full integration of students for the 5th of January. Obviously, the events that have unfolded in the course of the last few weeks, and many of you are well aware of them, have heightened and our sensitivity to being able to return students all one time into the classroom environment. And so it is difficult to say, given that this pandemic is something that is so dynamic, exactly when all students will be back. But what I can assure you is that working with the team that we have and with a dedicated team from the Ministry of Health and Wellness through the COVID monitoring unit, the intention is to get them back certainly as quickly as possible. We cannot simply afford to lose any more time.
Okay. Second question. You hinted to it in what you were, your presentation, that it seems that the blended approach has hindered the syllabus to some extent. Could you give us an idea as to the extent to which students are falling behind in this regard?
Well, let me correct you there. It isn't a case of that the blended approach is hindering the ability of students to keep up. We have been thrust into a pandemic, and by being thrust into the pandemic, even with all the best intentions of being able to introduce technology and to use all of the tools that are available to teachers, there needed to be a time frame within which that transition was made. And obviously teachers did not have the opportunity to take the time to learn the tools to make the transition to the blended approach. The blended approach has worked in some schools and it simply has benefited several students. But the reality is children learn differently. And there are some children who need to have somebody over their shoulder motivating them to be able to pay attention in the classroom. There are other students who can work quietly and they can work at home with limited instruction. We have tried to ensure that our teachers provide the necessary homework assignments for students. But again, in the home environment, if you don't have the necessary support, obviously there are some complications. And we've had the stories of parents not supporting the online environment, lots of disruptions in the background, people talking, cursing, doing all kinds of things inappropriate while children are trying to engage with their teachers. And we've also had the issues of connectivity, which is not something that is within the Ministry of Education's control alone, but all of us at some point or the other experience some issues of connectivity. And in many of our meetings as well, we have encountered the challenges that our teachers and our students have faced as well. And I think more than anything, that is one of the, it's one of the, not the only, but it certainly is a motivating factor to be able to get students back into the classroom, because there is a level of frustration you get when you cannot get onto the Zoom call or into the Google G Suite for Education program. Students are no different. And therefore, I think once we have that consensus that we need to take a different approach, we will work with what we have, but we are preparing in the event that we have to make a transition again to a blended approach to be able to facilitate that as well.
Okay. And my final question, in terms of the remedial work at school plants, could you give us an update? We had that issue with Lawrence Tigay that has been, how far along in terms of completion of those projects?
The works, as you can appreciate, the Christmas period is a very difficult period, as you can imagine, to be able to get all of the works completed. Many of our contractors themselves are trying to take a break. They've worked obviously right through the entire year. So we have had some challenges in terms of getting all of the works completed. But what we've been able to do is to ensure that we have all the scopes done. We have all the quotations, we've secured the funds, and some of the works have actually started on the respective school plans. So Lawrence Tigay, I believe Mr. Miller can speak to that more, but the work has actually commenced at the plant, and we're working through the next couple of days to try to rectify a number of the problems that would have been highlighted in the press, certainly.
Sorry, I know I said that was the last one, but you just just quickly, could you tell me then, would Lawrence Tigay be reopening on?
The intention at this stage is that the majority of the works will be completed prior to the reopening of school, but there are some works that can be done either after school or on the weekend. Again, we will be working with the team at the school to ensure that we have the phased approach back to the school environment. But I think it is also fair to say that the challenges there are not simply related to the infrastructural work that has to be done by the Ministry of Education. There are some genuine concerns in relation to the other environs and the pollutants and stuff in the surrounding area as well. And I think that Ministry of Health and Wellness, obviously, and Environmental Health are also looking into that also. But we have done everything from the Ministry of Education's end to be able to rectify the challenges that were on the actual school plant, and the commitment is there that we will continue to do so as well.
Hi, good afternoon, Minister. Just one question. Has there been any consultation between government and CXC as relates to the possible pushing back of the date of those exams? You spoke about pushing back the common entrance. We're just wondering if there was any discussions regarding the CXC.
Right. So CXC has been meeting not only with the local registrar, but they've been meeting with the Ministry of Education across the various countries across the region. One of the things that has been proposed is a number of options available to the region in relation to 2021 and the sitting of the examination. What I sought to do was to seek the input, as I would have done with the 11 plus change of the date, to allow the secondary teachers, along with the principals, to be able to weigh in on the proposals that are on the table. Because I believe that one of the benefits from so doing is that we have consensus on the way forward. And therefore, we have pretty much looked at what is the state of play in Barbados at this point in time within our schools. We want to know whether teachers are able to complete the syllabus, whether there are aspects of the syllabus that they will not be able to meet, whether they believe that the SPAs should be carried out in a different format for different subjects. And therefore, we want to be able to have full discussion, which I believe the recommendations have started to come in from the various schools. And it is my intention after to be able to meet with CXC, because we have to be able as a country to put our position to CXC from the persons who have to implement this system. And so I am hopeful that we will be in a position to speak to them very shortly once we've been able to go through the recommendations. Are there any questions?
Good afternoon. It's also a follow-on to the CXC, but as it pertains to the January 2021 exams, I know you are usually the one who coordinates that. What are preparations like for those exams?
I believe I'll ask Ms. Adamson to respond, but I think off the top, I believe that those are continuing as normal, correct? Yes, those are continuing as normal at this point in time.
Well, given the protocols, are there any changes to venues or anything like that?
None at this point. Okay. Any other questions? Well, let me take the opportunity to thank all of you from the media and certainly all who are watching online for participating in this briefing as it relates to the reopening of school for term 2. Let me just reiterate that the status quo remains as it was from last semester, but the intention is that we will move towards a gradual reintroduction of students into the school system, prioritizing first and foremost, obviously, our smallest kids, as well as our special needs, and certainly students who are preparing for examinations, whether at the primary level and certainly at the secondary school level. Over the course of the next couple of months, obviously, the intention is for us to be able to work with the COVID monitoring unit very closely with a dedicated team from that unit to help education to make the transition to our new norm. I won't say to a normal environment, but I will say to our new norm in education. And with that, I want to wish everyone a happy and certainly a blessed new year. It's been a difficult year, but out of all of the negative, I'm sure on the horizon is lots of positives. And I hope that as we reflect, we look at some of the things that we've been able to take away from 2020, especially the positive things, and that we are able to continue to work together, all stakeholders, to be able to get the best out of education. Thank you.